Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we continue our ongoing coverage of the Russia-Ukrainian war. Well, it looks like Russian forces have indeed withdrawn from the western bank of the Dnieper River. Up to 20 to 30,000 Russian forces have moved from the western bank of the Dnieper River and its defensive positions west of the Dnieper River and have moved to the eastern bank. So what is this going to do? What is this going to allow? What is going to happen next in the course of this war? Well, it's difficult to say. The Russians will definitely have the ability to defend its positions near Novokhovka and the eastern bank of the Dnieper River much more effectively than holding positions that it was holding in this very, very flat area west of the Dnieper River. It will further allow Russian forces to move troops and material to other areas of the conflict. Now, with that being said, so will the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians in the area near Kherson had upwards to 60+ thousand troops committed to operations against Russian forces near Kherson. So if the Russians are able to leave less forces along the Dnieper River, so will the Ukrainians. If the Russians are able to continue to defend the eastern bank of the Dnieper River with 10,000 troops, so will the Ukrainians. That will then allow 50+ thousand Ukrainian forces to be transferred to areas near Kramatorsk, Donetsk, Horlovika, Severodonetsk, and other areas. So while yes, this will allow the Russians to take some of these more elite units that were operating on the western bank of the Dnieper River, again, so will the Ukrainians. Unless the Russians are able to conduct interdiction operations and shut down the movement of Ukrainian forces crossing the Dnieper River and operating in eastern Ukraine, this is going to continue to be a very, very tough fight for Russian forces. Now, we've heard talk that the Russians are rebuilding its forces, are massing its forces in preparation for further offensive operations that could take place possibly summer of next year, maybe spring of next year, most likely late summer of next year. If we look back at other conflicts, and we are now essentially in month 9 of this ongoing conflict, the likelihood that it could last another year to 2 years is very likely. Now look, I've heard reports that indicate that the Russian forces are at half strength, that their military has been degraded significantly. While that's possible, that does not stop the Russian forces, the Russian military, from rebuilding, restructuring forces, drafting new troops, building new equipment, and fielding new units. I mean, if we look back at conflicts in World War II, The Russians had to do that, and they did it. If we look back at the Winter War between Russia and Finland, obviously that conflict was shorter than the conflict we're obviously seeing now. But again, same methodology. The Russians started off slow, suffered serious setbacks, were able to adapt, and then eventually created an environment where the Finns had to capitulate. But if the Russians are in this for the long haul, and they are starting to repurpose its civilian industry to fight war, if they are starting to mobilize its military forces, then the likelihood that the situation could change on the ground in the coming months, and especially going into summer of next year, remains on the table. Outside the realm of some sort of negotiated peace settlement that happens, the Russians are continuing to fight this war. I would say with the withdrawal from the western bank of the Dnieper River, the likelihood the Russians are going to refocus and commit to seizing control of the eastern bank of the Dnieper River still remains relatively high. If the Russians in this war were to stop with the status quo, that's going to be very, very difficult for the Russians politically. It's difficult to say what the war goals were for the Russians coming into this conflict. But we can say, at the start of the conflict, the war goals for the Russian military were definitely the seizure of Kiev. Now, I've heard the talk that Kiev was a diversion. The Russian forces that moved towards Kiev were designed to divert Ukrainian forces from operations in the east. I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I believe the Russians were stopped near Kiev. The Russians were trying to take control of Kiev. They were trying to conduct a decapitation operation, seize control of Kiev, to bring Ukraine to the table, and then to dictate peace terms by holding Kiev. That didn't happen. The Russians also, very likely, by crossing the Dnieper River, were looking to seize control of Odessa, Mykolaiv, and create that land corridor to the Transnistria. Didn't happen. The likelihood that is going to happen now is almost zero. So the only reasonable and obtainable military goals for the Russian armed forces at this point, large-scale objectives that will take the course of a year to 2 years, would be the seizure of the eastern bank of the Dnieper River and creating and putting a major terrain feature, meaning the Dnieper River, in between the Russian Federation and NATO-backed Ukraine. So at this point, it appears that the military goals of Russian forces right now, whether this is going to happen or not, it's two completely different things. But the goals right now would appear to be winning on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. It's going to be tough, though. And the Russians may not win this. But it looks like by moving those forces across the Dnieper River, giving the Russian forces the ability to lightly defend key crossing points across the Dnieper River and transferring large amounts of troops and equipment, to conduct operations near Zaporizhia and other places east of the Dnieper River is very, very likely. Compounding that, you have the continued mobilization that is occurring. So we'll continue to monitor, report, and continue to analyze what is happening on the ground. I would say at this point, a significant defeat for Russian forces by losing that area on the western bank of the Dnieper River. So they're going to have to come up with a big win within the next 6 months to change the dynamic on the ground, regain some sort of momentum. Because in all probability, this isn't going to go well in Russia, over well in Russia, in terms of what happened in Kherson, and really kind of continues to happen within the course of the conflict. And as I talked about before, the Ukrainians are all in, fully mobilized on a war footing. It's possible the Russians are heading that way, but still, the Ukrainians are giving 100%. The Russians, it's difficult to say in terms of national devotion to the conflict, just how much the Russians are putting into this. It's not 100%, like what we're seeing in Ukraine. And that's difficult to fight that kind of war when your opponent has fully mobilized and probably has 1 million personnel in the field. And especially when they're defending what they perceive as their homelands. So we'll continue to monitor, report, and bring you more information as we get it. Thanks for joining us today, and as always, have a good day.